Picture this. A lone rider approaches a forgotten settlement where the wind carries whispers of ancient traditions and forbidden choices. What happens when a civilized man from the East must navigate the unwritten laws of the Wild West? When love becomes a matter of survival, and tradition holds the power to destroy or unite an entire community. Today, I'm bringing you a story that will challenge everything you think you know about honor, choice, and belonging in the untamed frontier. This is a tale where hearts collide with customs, and where one man's decision will determine the fate of an entire village. Before we dive into this gripping story, make sure to subscribe to the channel and hit that notification bell. You won't want to miss the incredible stories we share every week. The dust cloud on the horizon grew larger as the afternoon sun beat down mercilessly on the barren landscape of western Kansas. James Mitchell adjusted his spectacles and wiped the sweat from his brow, his city clothes already showing the wear of 3 days' hard riding. The small settlement of Clearwater Ridge emerged from the heat haze like a mirage. Weathered wooden buildings clustered around a single dirt road. As his horse's hooves clattered against the hard-packed earth, curious faces appeared in doorways and windows. Children peeked from behind their mother's skirts, while weathered men paused their work to study the newcomer. James had expected this reception. Strangers were rare in settlements this remote, especially ones carrying books instead of guns. The schoolhouse stood at the far end of town, a modest structure with a bell tower that had seen better days. James dismounted and tied his horse to the hitching post, surveying his new domain. The building needed work. Several window panes were cracked, and the steps sagged under neglect. "You must be the new teacher." James turned to find a tall, imposing man approaching. His weathered face bore the marks of decades under the prairie sun, and his eyes held the sharp intelligence of someone accustomed to making difficult decisions. A silver star gleamed on his chest. "Sheriff Tom Brennan." The man introduced himself, extending a calloused hand. "Welcome to Clearwater Ridge, Mr. Mitchell." "Thank you, Sheriff. I'm looking forward to getting started." James shook the offered hand, noting the firm grip that spoke of both strength and sincerity. "Folks here are good people," Brennan said, his gaze sweeping over the settlement. "But they've got their ways, their traditions. Some go back to the founding of this place, near 20 years ago. You do well to respect them." There was something in the sheriff's tone that suggested more than simple advice. James nodded, though he wondered what traditions could be so significant in a frontier town barely 2 decades old. As if summoned by their conversation, a group of riders approached from the north. Even from a distance, James could see they rode with the confidence of people who owned the land they traversed. The lead rider was a man in his 50s, broad-shouldered and commanding, with silver threading through his dark hair. Behind him rode 2 young women. "That would be Chief Nathaniel Crow Feather," Sheriff Brennan said quietly. "His family founded this settlement. Those are his daughters, Sarah and Rebecca." As the riders drew closer, James understood why the sheriff's voice had carried reverence. The man called Chief possessed natural leadership. His daughters, riding side saddle with practiced ease, were indeed striking. One had raven black hair that caught the sunlight, while the other's auburn locks seemed to glow like fire. The group reined in their horses near the schoolhouse. Chief Crowfeather dismounted with fluid grace and approached, his daughters remaining mounted but watching intently. "Mr. Mitchell, I presume," the chief said, his voice carrying authority. "I am Nathaniel Crowfeather. These are my daughters, Sarah and Rebecca. We've come to welcome you to our community." James removed his hat respectfully. "The pleasure is mine, sir. I'm honored to be here." The daughter with black hair, Sarah, urged her horse forward slightly. "Father, perhaps Mr. Mitchell would join us for dinner tomorrow evening? He should meet the families whose children he'll be teaching." Her voice was melodious, cultured in a way that surprised James. This was no simple frontier settlement if it could produce such refinement. "An excellent suggestion," the chief agreed. "Mr. Mitchell, would 7 o'clock be suitable? Our home is the large house on the hill overlooking the town." James couldn't miss it. The house stood like a sentinel above the settlement, its white-painted walls speaking of prosperity. "I would be delighted to accept." Rebecca, the auburn-haired daughter, had remained silent during the exchange, but James caught her studying him with intelligent green eyes. When their gazes met, she offered a small smile that seemed to hold secrets. "Excellent," Chief Crowfeather said, remounting his horse. "Until tomorrow evening, then." As the family rode away, James watched them go, noting how other townspeople paused to acknowledge their passing. There was respect there, but also deference that spoke of deep-rooted traditions. "Influential family," James observed. Sheriff Brennan nodded slowly. "The Crowfeathers built this town from nothing. They own most of the land hereabouts, employ half the town. Good people, but they have their ways. Just remember that when you're here, you're not just a teacher. You're part of the fabric of this place." As the sheriff walked away, James stood alone in front of the schoolhouse, watching the dust settle. The sun was beginning its descent toward the horizon, painting the sky in shades of orange and gold. Somewhere in the distance, a coyote called to its pack. He had come to Clearwater Ridge, seeking a fresh start, a chance to make a difference in young lives far from the complications of city society. But as he unlocked the schoolhouse door and stepped into the musty interior, James couldn't shake the feeling that he had walked into something far more complex. The building was larger inside than it appeared, with rows of wooden desks facing a blackboard. Sunlight streamed through the windows, illuminating dust motes that danced in the still air. This would be his domain, his chance to shape the future of Clearwater Ridge through its children. As James began unpacking his books and supplies, he found himself thinking about the Crowfeather daughters. Both were clearly intelligent and well-educated, unusual for frontier women. Sarah's directness and Rebecca's thoughtful silence suggested different personalities, but both carried themselves with confidence. Tomorrow's dinner would be his first real introduction to the social fabric of Clearwater Ridge. James had learned that understanding a community meant understanding its leading families, their relationships, and their expectations. In a settlement this small and isolated, such knowledge could mean the difference between success and failure. As the sun set and the first stars appeared in the vast prairie sky, James lit a lamp and continued his preparations. Outside, the sounds of the settlement settling into evening routine drifted through the windows, mothers calling children home, the distant lowing of cattle. He had no way of knowing that his arrival had already set in motion events that would test everything he believed about choice, tradition, and the price of belonging to a community. The whispered conversations that would take place that night in the Crowfeather household would seal his fate in ways he couldn't yet imagine. The Crowfeather house commanded the landscape, like a fortress of civilization carved from the wilderness. As James approached on foot the following evening, he marveled at the structure's grandeur. 2 stories of pristine white clapboard, siding rose from native stone, while a wraparound porch offered respite from the prairie sun. Gas lamps flickered to life as dusk settled. James had spent considerable time selecting his attire. His best suit, though showing frontier wear, had been carefully brushed and pressed. First impressions mattered, especially in a community where he would need to earn trust and respect. The front door opened before he could knock, revealing a woman in her 40s, with graying hair pulled back elegantly. Her dress, while practical, was of fine quality, another indication of the family's prosperity. "Mr. Mitchell, welcome. I'm Martha Crowfeather, Nathaniel's wife. Please come in." The interior reinforced James's understanding of the family's status. The foyer featured polished hardwood floors, covered with Persian rugs. A crystal chandelier cast warm light over furnishings that would not have been out of place in a Boston drawing room. "Your home is magnificent, Mrs. Crowfeather," James said sincerely. "Thank you. We've worked hard to create something beautiful here." Nathaniel believes that civilization must be actively cultivated, not simply hoped for. She led him through a hallway lined with family portraits toward conversation sounds. The dining room was equally impressive, with a mahogany table that could seat 12 and a sideboard displaying fine china. Chief Crowfeather rose from his chair, extending his hand in greeting. "Mr. Mitchell, punctual as befits an educator. Please join us." Sarah and Rebecca were already seated, both having dressed with particular care. Sarah wore deep blue that complemented her dark hair, while Rebecca had chosen emerald green that brought out her eyes. Both smiled as he took a seat, though James detected subtle tension between them. "I trust you've had time to examine the schoolhouse," Chief Crowfeather said as Martha served the first course. "Yes, sir. It's a fine building, though it could use some repairs. I've made a list of necessary improvements." "Excellent. Present it to me tomorrow, and we'll see what can be arranged. Education is the foundation of any lasting community." The conversation flowed easily through the meal. James learned that the Crowfeather family had been instrumental in founding Clearwater Ridge, purchasing land and encouraging settlement. Chief Crowfeather had served as the unofficial leader since its inception. "Tell us about yourself, Mr. Mitchell," Sarah said during the main course. "What brought you to our corner of the world?" "I taught in Boston for several years, but I grew tired of city education constraints. Here, I can make a real difference in children's lives, help them build something meaningful." "And you have no family back east?" Rebecca asked quietly. "No one who will miss you?" There was something in her tone that suggested more than polite interest. "No immediate family, no. My parents passed several years ago, and I never married. I'm free to make my own choices about where and how to live." He caught a quick glance between the sisters at his words. "Freedom to choose is precious," Chief Crowfeather observed, "though sometimes our choices are constrained by circumstances beyond our control or by obligations to others." The conversation continued through dessert and coffee, covering literature to politics to frontier challenges. James was impressed by the family sophistication. Both daughters were clearly well-read and thoughtful, though their personalities were distinctly different. As the evening wound down, Chief Crowfeather suggested they adjourn to the front porch for brandy. The women excused themselves, moving to the parlor where their voices could be heard in quiet conversation. The night air was cool and clear, with stars scattered across the vast sky like diamonds. Chief Crowfeather poured generous measures of brandy, and the two men settled into comfortable chairs overlooking the settlement below. "Mr. Mitchell," the chief began after several minutes of silence, "I want to speak frankly with you about certain aspects of life in Clearwater Ridge." James sensed this was the real purpose of the evening's invitation. "I'm listening, sir." "When we founded this settlement, we faced challenges that required unconventional solutions. We were isolated, vulnerable to both natural disasters and human threats. Survival depended on unity, on everyone understanding their role and responsibilities." The chief paused to draw on his cigar. "Over the years, we developed certain traditions, ways of ensuring unity and stability. These customs have served us well, but they may seem strange to outsiders." "What sort of customs?" James asked, though he was beginning to suspect where this conversation was heading. "Marriage customs, primarily. In a small, isolated community, the choice of marriage partners affects everyone. Alliances between families, property distribution, raising children, all have implications beyond the individuals involved." James felt a chill. "I see. My daughters are both of marriageable age," Chief Crowfeather continued. "They are intelligent, accomplished young women who will make excellent wives. In our tradition, when an eligible man arrives, particularly one in a position of influence like yourself, he is expected to choose a bride from among the available young women." The brandy suddenly tasted bitter. Expected by whom? By the community, by tradition, by the understanding that individual desires must sometimes be subordinated to collective needs. The chief's voice remained calm, but there was steel beneath the courtesy. "My daughters cannot both remain unmarried. The community expects them to marry and establish families." James set down his brandy glass with an unsteady hand. "And if I refuse to participate?" "That would be unfortunate," Chief Crowfeather said quietly. "The position of schoolteacher is not merely a job here. It's a role within the community structure. Someone who rejects our ways cannot effectively serve in such a position." The threat was politely delivered but unmistakable. "How long do I have to make this choice?" "The harvest festival is in 3 weeks. Traditionally, such announcements are made then, when the whole community gathers. It would be appropriate for you to make your decision by then." They sat in silence, the weight of the conversation settling between them. Finally, Chief Crowfeather spoke again. I know this seems harsh to someone from the outside, but consider this. Both of my daughters are remarkable young women. Either would make you an excellent wife. You would be welcomed into one of the most influential families in the territory." James thought of Sarah's directness and intelligence, of Rebecca's thoughtful beauty and quiet strength. Under different circumstances, he might indeed have found himself attracted to either. But the idea of being forced to choose, of having his future dictated by community tradition, rankled against everything he believed. "May I ask what happens to the daughter I don't choose?" Chief Crow Feather's expression grew somber. "That is a concern. Traditionally, she would be expected to marry within the community. But the pool of eligible men is limited and grows smaller each year as young people leave for opportunities in larger towns." The full weight settled on James's shoulders. He wasn't just choosing a wife. He was potentially condemning one of these remarkable women to spinsterhood in a community where marriage was apparently the only acceptable path. "I need time to think," James said finally. "Of course. But remember, 3 weeks. The community will be expecting an announcement." As James walked back to his quarters, his mind raced with implications. He had come to Clearwater Ridge seeking freedom and the chance to make a difference. Instead, he found himself trapped in a web of tradition and expectation that threatened to define his entire future. The schoolhouse bell rang across Clearwater Ridge at precisely 8 o'clock, calling the children to their first day with a new teacher. James had arrived an hour early, using the time to arrange desks and try to calm his nerves. The conversation with Chief Crow Feather had haunted his sleep. 15 children filed through the door, ranging in age from 6 to 16. They came from various families: the blacksmith's children, the general store owner's daughter, the rancher's sons and daughters. James noted that several bore distinctive features, suggesting Native American heritage, a reminder of the complex cultural mixing that had shaped this frontier community. "Good morning, class," James began, standing before the blackboard. "I'm Mr. Mitchell, your new teacher. I'm looking forward to getting to know each of you and helping you learn and grow." The day proceeded better than he had dared hope. The children were eager and respectful, hungry for knowledge in the way that only those who understood its scarcity could be. James found himself energized by their enthusiasm. During lunch break, as the children played in the schoolyard, James noticed 2 figures approaching on horseback. Sarah and Rebecca Crow Feather rode with easy grace, their riding habits practical yet elegant. They dismounted near the schoolhouse with what appeared to be a picnic basket. "Mr. Mitchell," Sarah called out, "we thought you might appreciate some lunch on your first day." The children had noticed the visitors and gathered around with obvious affection. It was clear that the Crow Feather daughters were well loved in the community, taking active roles in the family's lives. "Miss Sarah, Miss Rebecca," called out a young girl with pigtails, "did you bring cookies?" Rebecca laughed, a sound like silver bells. "Perhaps a few, Emma, but only for children who have been good students this morning." As the sisters distributed treats to the delighted children, James found himself observing them with new eyes. Knowing what he now knew about community expectations, he watched for signs of rivalry or tension. But if such feelings existed, they were well hidden beneath genuine sisterly affection. "How was your first morning?" Sarah asked as they settled on a blanket in the schoolhouse shade. "Better than I expected," James replied honestly. "The children are remarkable, so eager to learn." "They should be," Rebecca said quietly. "Education is precious here. Most of their parents had little formal schooling, and they understand what opportunities knowledge can provide." The conversation flowed naturally as they shared the meal. James found himself relaxing despite the undercurrent of tension about his situation. Both women were intelligent conversationalists, and he could see why they were considered such prizes. "Mr. Mitchell," Sarah said as they packed up lunch remains, "I hope our father's conversation last evening didn't disturb you too greatly." James looked up sharply, surprised by her directness. "You know about that." Rebecca's cheeks colored slightly. It's difficult to keep secrets in a house, especially when those secrets concern your own future. "And how do you feel about this tradition?" James asked carefully. The The sisters exchanged a look that spoke of many private conversations. Sarah, as usual, spoke first. "It's the way things have always been done here. Our community has survived and prospered because everyone understands their role and responsibilities. Marriage isn't just about personal happiness, it's about building something larger." "But surely you have your own feelings about the matter," James pressed. "Your own preferences and desires." Rebecca spoke softly but clearly. "Of course we do. We're not unfeeling creatures to be bartered like cattle. But we also understand that our choices affect more than just ourselves." "And if I were to refuse to participate in this tradition?" Sarah's expression grew serious. "Then you would find life in Clearwater Ridge very difficult. The community would see you as selfish, as someone who puts his own desires above the collective good. You might find parents reluctant to send their children to school." The picture she painted was bleak but believable. James had seen how tightly knit the community was, how much respect the Crowfeather family commanded. To defy them would indeed mean isolation. "But there's something else you should consider," Rebecca added quietly. "If you leave, what happens to the children? How long before another teacher can be found? How many months or years might pass before someone else is willing to come to such a remote place?" It was a masterful argument, appealing to his sense of duty. James realized that both women were not only beautiful and intelligent, but also skilled in persuasion. They understood exactly how to present their case in terms that would resonate with his values. The afternoon classes proceeded smoothly, but James found his attention divided. He watched the children with new eyes, thinking about Rebecca's words. These young people depended on him not just for education, but for hope of a better future. As the school day ended and children dispersed, James remained at his desk, grading papers and wrestling with his thoughts. The sun was setting when he heard a soft knock. Sheriff Brennan entered, removing his hat respectfully. "Evening, Mr. Mitchell. Thought I'd stop by and see how your first day went." "Well enough, Sheriff. The children are a credit to their families." Brennan nodded, settling into one of the student desks with difficulty. "Good to hear. I expect Nathaniel spoke with you last night about community expectations." "He did." James set down his pen and looked directly at the sheriff. "Tell me honestly, what happens if I refuse to choose between his daughters?" Brennan was quiet for a long moment. "You'd be finished here, that's certain. But it's more than that. This tradition isn't just about the crow feathers. It's about the survival of the community itself." "How so?" "Think about it. We're isolated out here, dependent on each other for everything. When young people leave for opportunities elsewhere, we lose not just individuals, but entire family lines. The crow feather daughters represent the future of this place." James began to understand the deeper implications. "You're saying this is about demographic survival." "Exactly. We need families, children, continuity. The marriage customs ensure that happens, that alliances are formed that strengthen rather than divide the community." "But surely there must be other eligible men." Brennan shook his head. "Most young men leave as soon as they're able. They head to cities or mining camps, looking for adventure and fortune. The ones who stay are either already married or wouldn't be suitable matches." The full scope of James's dilemma was becoming clear. He wasn't just being asked to choose a wife. He was being asked to participate in the community's strategy for survival. "What would you do, Sheriff, in my position?" Brennan stood slowly. "I'd remember that sometimes the greatest freedom comes from accepting our responsibilities to others. Both of those young women would make fine wives." After the sheriff left, James sat alone in the darkening schoolhouse, surrounded by the weight of impossible choices. Outside, the sounds of the settlement continued. Families gathering for dinner, children being called in from play. He thought about his life in Boston, the freedom he had taken for granted, the luxury of making decisions based solely on personal preference. That life seemed impossibly distant now. 3 weeks had passed like fever dream. James had thrown himself into teaching duties with desperate intensity, as if education could somehow provide clarity for his impossible situation. The children had responded with enthusiasm and affection, making his potential departure even more painful. During those weeks, both Sarah and Rebecca had made subtle but persistent efforts to spend time with him. Sarah had volunteered to help organize the school's small library, working alongside him in afternoons to catalog donated books. Her conversation was stimulating, her laugh infectious. Rebecca, meanwhile, had taken to bringing him lunch several times a week, often staying to help with younger children during reading lessons. She had a natural gift with students, patient and encouraging in a way that spoke of genuine maternal instincts. The cruel irony was that under different circumstances, he might have found himself genuinely courting either woman. Both were remarkable in their own ways, but the knowledge that he was being forced to choose, that his decision was predetermined by community expectation rather than natural affection, poisoned every interaction. The harvest festival dawned clear and bright, with crisp autumn air carrying the scent of ripening grain. The entire community had spent days preparing for the celebration, the largest social gathering of the year. Tables groaned under contributed dishes. A makeshift stage had been erected, and colorful bunting fluttered in the prairie breeze. James dressed carefully in his best suit, knowing all eyes would be on him. His hand shook slightly as he adjusted his tie, and he caught sight of his pale, drawn face in the small mirror. The past 3 weeks had taken their toll. The festival was already in full swing when he arrived at the town square. Children ran between adults, their laughter mixing with fiddle music and animated conversation. The aroma of roasting meat and fresh-baked bread filled the air. "Mr. Mitchell," called out Emma, the pigtailed girl from his class. "Come see the pie contest." Miss Sarah and Miss Rebecca both entered. James allowed himself to be led to a table displaying desserts. Both Crow-Feather daughters stood nearby, accepting compliments. Sarah had made an elaborate apple pie with lattice crust, while Rebecca's offering was a delicate lemon cake decorated with crystallized flowers. "They're both beautiful," James said diplomatically, earning smiles from both women. The next several hours passed in a blur of forced normalcy. James judged the children's spelling bee, admired quilts displayed by the women's auxiliary, and listened politely to discussions of cattle prices and weather patterns. But underneath the surface pleasantries, he could feel tension building. As the afternoon wore on, Chief Crow-Feather took the stage to address the gathered community. His speech covered usual topics: gratitude for a successful harvest, recognition of community achievements, plans for winter. But James knew the real purpose was yet to come. "Before we conclude today's festivities," the chief said, his voice carrying easily across the square, "I believe our new schoolteacher has something he'd like to share with us." The crowd fell silent, all eyes turning to James. He felt his mouth go dry as he made his way to the stage, his legs unsteady. Sarah and Rebecca stood with their parents near the front, their faces carefully composed but tension visible. James reached the stage and turned to face the assembled community. These people had welcomed him, trusted him with their children's education, and now they waited for him to fulfill his part of their unspoken social contract. "Friends," he began, his voice stronger than expected, "3 weeks ago, I arrived in Clearwater Ridge as a stranger. You welcomed me into your community, trusted me with your most precious possessions, your children. I've come to understand that being part of this community means more than just performing a job." He paused, his gaze finding Sarah and Rebecca in the crowd. Both women watched him with carefully controlled emotion. "I've also come to understand that some traditions, while they may seem strange to outsiders, serve important purposes. The custom of community involvement in marriage decisions ensures that individual choices serve the greater good." A murmur of approval rippled through the crowd. Chief Crow-Feather nodded slightly, his expression satisfied. "However," James continued, and the murmur died away, "I've also come to believe that some traditions, no matter how well-intentioned, can become prisons that trap good people in impossible situations." The silence that followed was deafening. James could see confusion and growing concern in the faces before him. Both Sarah and Rebecca Crow-Feather are remarkable women who deserve to marry for love, not obligation. They deserve to choose their own partners based on affection and compatibility, not community pressure. And I deserve the same right. Chief Crow-Feather's face had gone rigid, and James could see Sheriff Brennan's hand moving instinctively toward his gun belt. Therefore, James said quickly, before he could lose his nerve, I propose a different solution. I will remain in Clearwater Ridge as your teacher, for as long as you'll have me. I will serve this community with dedication and loyalty. But I will not choose between two women I barely know, and I will not participate in a tradition that reduces marriage to a business transaction. The crowd erupted in shocked murmurs and angry voices. James saw some faces that showed support, but many more that reflected outrage and betrayal. Furthermore, he continued, raising his voice over the commotion, I believe this community is strong enough and wise enough to find new ways to ensure its future, ways that don't require sacrificing individual freedom. Chief Crow Feather stepped forward, his face dark with anger. Mr. Mitchell, you are making a grave mistake. This community has survived and prospered because we understand that individual desires must sometimes be subordinated to collective needs. Your refusal shows selfishness that makes you unfit to teach our children. With respect, sir, James replied, I believe teaching children to think for themselves, to question traditions that no longer serve them, is exactly what education should accomplish. The argument that followed was heated but brief. It became clear that James's position was untenable. The community that had welcomed him 3 weeks earlier now saw him as a threat. Parents began talking about withdrawing their children from school, and several men made it clear that his continued presence would not be tolerated. As the crowd began to disperse in angry knots of conversation, James found himself standing alone on the stage, the weight of his decision settling around him like a shroud. He had chosen principle over pragmatism, individual freedom over community acceptance. Sarah and Rebecca approached the stage as the square emptied. Both women's faces showed a mixture of emotions, disappointment, respect, and something that might have been relief. That was very brave, Rebecca said quietly, and very foolish. I'm sorry, James replied. I know this makes your situations more difficult. Sarah shook her head. Actually, it doesn't. You've given us something we didn't expect, a choice. Your refusal has shown the community that perhaps it's time to reconsider some of our ways. What will you do now? Rebecca asked. James looked around the square, at the decorations still fluttering in the breeze, at the remnants of a celebration that had turned into his public exile. I'll pack my things and leave in the morning. There are other towns, other schools that need teachers. And us? Sarah asked. What happens to the unmarried daughters of Nathaniel Crow Feather now that the new teacher has rejected our community's most sacred tradition? James met her gaze directly. You'll do what you should have been free to do all along. Make your own choices about your own lives. Maybe you'll find love with someone who chooses you freely, or maybe you'll discover that marriage isn't the only path to a meaningful life. As the sisters walked away, James remained on the stage for several more minutes, watching the sun set over the prairie. Tomorrow he would leave Clearwater Ridge, carrying with him the knowledge that he had chosen principle over security, freedom over belonging. The harvest festival was over, and with it, James Mitchell's brief tenure as the teacher of Clearwater Ridge. But perhaps, in refusing to choose between two remarkable women, he had given them, and the community, something more valuable than his compliance with tradition. As the stars appeared in the vast prairie sky, James walked back to the schoolhouse one last time, knowing that his real education in the ways of the frontier was complete. He had learned that sometimes the greatest courage lies not in conforming to expectations, but in having the strength to forge a different path. 6 months later, James Mitchell stood before a new classroom in a growing town in Colorado, watching his students work diligently. The position had come with fewer complications and more freedom, though he often found himself thinking about the children he had left behind in Clearwater Ridge. A letter had arrived the previous week from Sheriff Brennan, bringing news that both surprised and pleased him. Sarah Crow Feather had married a young lawyer who had arrived in town 2 months after James's departure, a man who had courted her properly and won her heart through genuine affection. Rebecca had chosen a different path entirely, using her inheritance to open a school for girls in Kansas City. The community had survived James's rejection of their traditions, and perhaps had even grown stronger for it. Chief Crow Feather had reportedly softened his stance on arranged marriages, allowing that perhaps the old ways needed to evolve with changing times. As James dismissed his class for the day, he reflected on the lessons he had learned in Clearwater Ridge. Sometimes standing up for principle came at a great cost, but sometimes that cost was worth paying. He had chosen freedom over security, individual conscience over community pressure. The frontier was changing, and with it, the communities that dotted the vast landscape. Perhaps his small act of rebellion had played a part in that change, showing that even the most entrenched traditions could be questioned and, when necessary, abandoned in favor of something better. Outside his classroom window, the Colorado mountains rose majestically against the sky, reminding him that there were always new horizons to explore, new challenges to face, and new opportunities to make a difference. James Mitchell had learned that sometimes the greatest victory lay not in making the expected choice, but in having the courage to choose differently. And there you have it, a story of courage, tradition, and the price of standing up for what you believe in. If you enjoyed this tale from the Wild West, make sure to subscribe to our channel for more incredible stories every week. Hit that like button if this story moved you, and let us know in the comments what you thought about James's difficult decision. Until next time, keep exploring the untold stories of the frontier.